Welcome everybody to what is the first of the Department of English Literature and Creative Writing research seminars here at the University of Lancaster, our very first seminar online. And so my pleasure then to welcome Dr. Niall Gildea on behalf of the department, and he will be joining myself and my colleague Professor Benoit Peeters for the seminar. The way things are going to go is that Benoit, as many things, including the biographer of Derrida, will respond to Niall, and then I'm going to hand over to Niall in about 1 second to talk to us around and about his recently published book, Jacques Derrida's Cambridge Affair, which came out with Roman and Littlefield. So without any further ado, over to you, Niall.
Thanks, John. Thank you all for coming. I hope you can hear me okay. Okay, so John, if you could put up that first slide.
It's coming.
Just the title slide, really. Okay, so I'm going to give a general outline of the book as a whole, and then I'll give a short paper which develops just one of its themes. So the book is called Jacques Derrida's Cambridge Affair, Deconstruction, Philosophy and Institutionality, and it's published, as John said, by Roman and Littlefield in their Futures of the Archive series. There's quite a lot of Derrida in the book itself, but I'm going to keep everything quite light on that score today. Before I start, I'll say thank you to the series editors for the book, Arthur Bradley and Simon Swift, to John Shadd, who deserves a lot of credit for the book existing, and to Benoit. It's a privilege to have you responding to the book. Okay, so on Wednesday, February the 5th, 1992, in the Cambridge University Reporter, Cambridge's Vice-Chancellor announced the 9 people on whom honorary degrees would be conferred that year. For the title Doctor of Letters Honoris Causa, Jacques Derrida's name was given in the form of a grace to be submitted to the Regent House at a congregation on the 21st of March 1992. It is expected, the text continues, that admission to the title of the degree will take place at a congregation to be held on Friday, 12th of June 1992. Okay, so a week later, the Vice-Chancellor announces the following. The graces for the conferment of honorary degrees in 1992 were published in the Reporter on 18th of March and were submitted to the Regent House at the congregation on 21st of March. At the congregation, notice of non-plaquet was given in respect of Grace 5 for the conferment of the honorary degree of Doctor of Letters on Monsieur Jacques Derrida. Under the provisions of Regulation 17 for the conduct of business, the grace was withdrawn. The Vice-Chancellor gives notice that a congregation will be held at 2 p.m. on Saturday, 16th of May 1992, when the grace will be resubmitted and a vote will be taken. Voting will be in person at the congregation. Okay, so this notice of non-plaquet, which means it is not pleasing, and the announcement of a vote on Derrida's honorary doctorate, these two things mark the beginning of an academic debate known as the Cambridge Affair. Derrida's work, and occasionally more personal matters, were weighed against ideas as diverse as Cambridge's reputation, the reputation of the discipline of philosophy, and the creeping so-called neoliberalism infecting UK higher education at that time. Fly sheets were circulated enjoining members of the university to vote either for Derrida's honorary, which would be to vote plaquet, or against it, which would be to vote non-plaquet. Derrida was ultimately awarded his doctorate by a majority of 336 to 204, and you can actually go to the Cambridge University Library and read the names of the people who voted for or against, and it's quite a good archive, actually. My favourite part of it is an episode where Derrida was asked to provide measurements of his height and the circumference of his head so that a gown could be tailored for him. So he gives a height of 1 meter 71 centimeters, and then he obligingly tries to represent this in imperial terms and comes up with a height of 7 feet 6 inches, which is quite a thought, really. So between the non-plaquette notice of March 92 and the final article written about the affair, which was in June 1993, a group of academics, mostly from one institution, debated whether a third party's body of work merited the name of philosophy. Now, Derrida's is a corpus which questions with uncommon force the assumptions underpinning such a debate. Now, I argue in the book that the question of philosophy is really where the affair begins and ends. Derrida's nomination had been made by members of Cambridge's English and Modern Languages faculties, and the fact that this had happened without the approval of the philosophy faculty produced the point of contention from which everything else followed. Many people believed that if the nomination ought to have come from anyone, it ought to have come from the philosophy faculty, and if it hadn't come from them, then it shouldn't have come at all. Now, this demand to identify Derrida as part of one already existing discipline with already existing contours is of a piece with a kind of positivism which is currently hindering many researchers in the humanities and poses a threat to academic meritocracy. And it isn't doing any favors, I don't think, for the study of philosophy. A serious reading of the ideas of philosophy, or if you like, the philosophies of philosophy, which are invoked in this debate, shows that this imagined disciplinary stability is a kind of fantasy. The more that the absolute facticity of philosophy was insisted upon in the Cambridge affair, the more the philosophical archive and history to which this insistence appealed buckled under the weight of this claim. And so if I were to condense the book into a single statement, that would be it, really. So this makes the Cambridge affair a case study which highlights, among other things, problems both with absolute defences of existing canons and also with claims to be in the business of straightforwardly busting or decolonising them. So there are three basic threads to the book. Firstly, the constitution of philosophy and of a general university disciplinarity, which philosophy was said along Kantian lines to subtend and to in some way comprehend. In relation to this, Derrida's work was said to be outrageous. The second thread is has to do with the desirable political underpinnings of an academic or higher educational ethos, which Derrida's work was said to frustrate or undermine. And the third thread is the supposed virtue of the conferral of institutional merit itself, such as, but not exclusively, the conferral of an honorary degree. Rather than unpack the first two points propositionally, the paper I'll read will hopefully convey something of their importance, sort of in action. As for the third point, at no stage during the Cambridge affair really did any contributor question the desirability of the desire to incorporate Derrida into and in the name of that university. Now, this might appear at first glance to be quite a trivial point, but the stakes of it have become clarified, for instance, in the recent work of the deconstructionist Fred Moten, who writes in relation to Hannah Arendt's response to the ordeal of Elizabeth Eckford and the Little Rock Nine in 1957. Moten writes of what he calls a general institutionality, which insufficiently examines the logic of its own desire and drive to accumulate, seeing this rapacity only in terms of a self-satisfying welcome, whereas Moten regards it as an essential component of a certain xenophobia underpinning a philosophical generalization of society and sociality more broadly. Okay, so that's a kind of general introduction to the book and some of its themes. So the paper I'll read today, I've called it A Virtuous Middle Ground, the Politics of Deconstruction in Derrida's Cambridge Affair. So the title of this talk, A Virtuous Middle Ground, comes from a late paper by Raymond Williams, who died 4 years before the Cambridge Affair, but would have been an interesting contributor to it. Williams, in an implicit critique of Aristotle's golden mean, writes, I'm quoting here, "The idea of a virtuous middle ground, proved to be virtuous because it is attacked from opposite directions, conceals one crucial assumption, that what is being attacked is itself simple and coherent. Otherwise, nothing is proved, since one variation may be attacked from one position and a quite different variation from another." So, funnily enough, Williams is actually talking about the Arts Council here. And what he says is valuable advice indeed for the good conscience of the political moderate who believes that they must be right because the number of people who think they're wrong is nicely distributed on all sides. But what is useful here is Williams' presumption that the object of attack may self-divide into variations, whereas the subject positions which do the attacking are relatively constant. We might turn his observation onto itself by remarking that, in his terms, it conceals one crucial assumption, that the positions of attack are themselves simple and coherent. And I'll show what I mean now with reference specifically to two important texts in the Cambridge Affair debate. Okay, so the first is a letter to the Times Higher in May 1992 by Graham McCann, who is now a well-known writer and historian, in which McCann expresses admiration for Derrida's work, but states his author's intention to vote non-placet, which he went on to do. McCann writes that when Derrida's nomination was first announced, he didn't consider opposing it. What prompted his change of mind were the perceived consequences of what he calls, quote, Derrida's failure to discourage some very destructive ideas associated with his work, end quote, a failure which engenders a disproportionate sense of its broader significance and political applicability. McCann argues that the campaign for Derrida's honorary is hyperbolic in two ways. Firstly, it exaggerates the stakes of a local and relatively minor issue. Quote, all Derrida is facing is the possible loss of walking along King's Parade in a funny hat and meeting Prince Philip, end quote. And secondly, that this exaggeration intimates a set of ethical priorities whose insular bent Derrida's work encourages. McCann refers to a familiar shorthand in the reception of Derrida, quote, that interpretation is a rich and complicated process in which it is extremely difficult to accept crude notions of good and bad, true or false, end quote, and suggests that whilst this, quote, may have been quite a revelation to someone who spent their formative years at Eton or Shrewsbury, down my way it was never an issue, end quote. Down McCann's way, quote, what was an issue was the need to make sense of a fairly wretched situation and do all one could to improve it. This is a need which is muffled, to say the least, in Derrida and has been all but smothered to death by his vastly more conceited group of followers, end quote. Although McCann imagines he would agree with the Derrida campaigners on most matters, he sees the amplified relativism accompanying Derrida's reception in Britain as a correlative to a sort of diminishing material attentiveness. For McCann, Derrida's followers, as he calls them, comprise, quote, an extraordinarily privileged community which seems so much more concerned with ideas than with people, end quote. And it is sad, he says, that they should now of all times seem so ready to fight so zealously on behalf of someone who appears so disinterested in other people's suffering. So McCann objects to the currentness of Derrida's work and its reception on the grounds of its advocacy of a political quietism which is ignorant of material circumstances. And we can guess that McCann is alluding to unemployment rates under the Conservative Party at that time from his assertion that, quote, if I do vote, I will have to walk past the two teenage boys who are now living in the street outside my faculty. I really cannot believe that they count for so little when Derrida's degree counts for so much, end quote. According to McCann's own logic, the most appropriate thing to have done then would have actually been to refrain from voting and not spend time and effort thinking and writing about Derrida's degree. But the crucial thing here is the link that is made between conservatism and Derrida based on a perceived shared negligence. So McCann's is an especially polemical instance of a homology made throughout the Cambridge Affair. The theologian Brian Hebblethwaite, who was especially antagonistic, juxtaposes Derrida and conservatism owing to a perceived shared Philistinism. So this is Hebblethwaite. This is the second text I'm looking at today. Our universities are held in contempt anyway by a government of Philistines, as Michael Dummett, in a preface to another book, has powerfully lamented. There seems to be little we can do to reverse this. But I should have thought we could have avoided the internal contempt we bring upon ourselves when, instead of repudiating the enemies of reason, truth, and objectivity, we honour them, end quote. Hebblethwaite supports this juxtaposition of Derrida and conservatism with reference to the preface to Michael Dummett's book, Frege, Philosophy of Mathematics. This preface, completed in July 1990 in Oxford, laments that, quote, British universities are in the course of being transformed by ideologues who misunderstand everything about academic work, end quote. This is a familiar complaint at that time, but perhaps the reason Hebblethwaite chose it was because it goes on to narrow the focus of the threat posed by Thatcherite policy on higher education, from the university at large to the philosophy faculty specifically. Thanks, John. Third slide, please. So this is Dummett. The plan of the ideologues is to increase academic productivity by creating conditions of intense competition. Academics' output is monitored by the use of performance indicators, measuring the number of words published per year. Wittgenstein, who died in 1951, having published only one short article after the Tractatus of 1922, would plainly not have survived such a system. It is obviously as objectionable in a capitalist as in a communist country that politicians should decide how the universities are to be run, but it is catastrophic when those politicians display total ignorance of the need to judge academic productivity on principles quite different from those applicable to industry. Our masters show some small awareness that, as in industry, quality is relevant as well as quantity. Their performance indicators are sometimes modified by the use of more sophisticated criteria, such as counting the number of references made by other writers to a given article. Frege would never have survived such a test. His writings were very seldom referred to in his lifetime. Overproduction defeats the very purpose of academic publication. It long ago became impossible to keep pace with the spate of books and of professional journals whose number increases every year. Once this happens, their production becomes an irrelevance to a working academic, save for the occasional book or article he happens to stumble upon. This applies particularly to philosophy. Historians may be able to ignore much of their colleagues' work as irrelevant to their periods, but philosophers are seldom so specialized that there is anything they can afford to disregard in virtue of its subject matter. Given their need for time to teach, to study the classics of philosophy and to think, they cannot afford to plough through the plethora of not bad, not good books and articles in the hope of hitting on the one that will surely cast light upon the problems with which they are grappling. Hence, if they are sensible, they ignore them altogether. Yeah, so that's Dummett. That's the text that Hebblethwaite's referring to. So there are many important points here. Firstly, the relation of present to conditional tense. The actuality of the government is opposed to a kind of negative conditionality of the philosophy faculty, the philosophy canon, sorry, the philosophical canon. So Wittgenstein would plainly not have survived such a system. Frege would never have survived such a test. The authentically philosophical becomes what would not survive if it were transplanted into the actual. Secondly, Dummett develops this philosophical non-actuality by distinguishing between the philosopher and the historian, following Aristotle's distinction and updating it for the modern university. The historian deals in particulars and so is reconcilable with the Thatcherite university model, whereas the philosopher's work is ideally so general as to be completely irreconcilable not only with the Thatcherite program, but with other academic disciplines. The only thing breaking the symmetry, interestingly, is that here Aristotle's proximity between philosophy and poetry has been forgotten. This forgetting is the effect of an Aristotelian distinction between philosophy and poetry and history, encountering a Kantian one, which is a distinction between philosophy and everything else. Thirdly, Dummett seems to conclude that the only feasible course for philosophy to take at this point is to abscond from the present entirely. The opposition between teaching, studying the classics of philosophy and thinking on the one hand, and ploughing through the plethora of what is being produced in the present in the name of the discipline on the other, this opposition is important. Dummett figures the academic discipline of philosophy as Thatcherism's scapegoat by virtue of its singular scope, or rather he claims that the survival of authentic philosophy is unthinkable under the auspices of a government which considers the university within its purview. Now, this last claim is actually one with which Derrida would and did agree, and the first slide I showed just had a newspaper cutting to that effect, but there are other instances where he writes to people who are organising kind of anti-Thatcherite conferences and expresses his opposition to the Thatcherite model. So it is a claim with which he did agree. However, it's telling that Dummett immediately uses the notion of overproduction to imply two classes of philosophical producer, the authentic philosopher and a kind of philosophical hoi polloi who contribute to the discipline only this disabling aspect of overproduction. The first class, crucially, is non-actual from the perspective of the Thatcherite program. It teaches, it studies the canon, and it thinks, but it doesn't apparently actually produce any work, which is the activity required to make it actual from the perspective of performance indicators and so on. The second class does produce, often abundantly and witlessly, but the implication is that it doesn't do any teaching, canon studying, or thinking. So Dummett's text elides a widespread and understandable objection to Thatcherism with a disingenuous assertion that a position of elitism has been forced on philosophers by that government, as though intellectual atavism is the only possible course of action. Dummett doesn't actually use the word Philistine here. He prefers ideologue, which recalls, ironically enough, the terminology used in the contemporary Thatcherite hunt for Marxist elements in further and higher education. And ideologue was the term that the Thatcherites used for the Marxist teachers and so on. But Philistine is the term by which Hebblethwaite translates his arguments in opposition to Derrida. For Dummett and Hebblethwaite, the Philistinism of the government is shown by its implementation of measures which seek to dissolve the putative distinction between authentic philosophy and excess, which seek to bloat the body philosophic beyond recognition. And there is an aesthetic subtext here. As Malcolm Bull observes via Michael Thompson, a Philistine is one who welcomes, quote, the absolute negation of the aesthetic. Moreover, the Philistine embraces the devaluation of the aesthetic in its Kantian inflection as an experience of cognition which is somehow set aside. So in a book from 1979 called Poetic Presence and Illusion, the literary critic Murray Krieger condensed this complaint into just a few sentences with reference to post-structuralism, which in his terms is more or less synonymous with deconstruction. So this is Krieger. It may well be that the post-structuralist mood is the most appropriate one to account for the revolutionary art produced in our culture these last decades, an anti-aesthetic for an anti-art. The philosophical assault on man's symbols may both mirror and justify what man has been of late doing with them, or refusing to do with them. It would hardly be a flattering comment to suggest that, if post-structuralism turns out to be a theoretical partner of recent activities in the arts, they deserve one another. And I trust it is a more than just reactionary comment to suggest that the recent wars on metaphysics and art alike have hardly produced in the arts worthy successors to the tradition they would destroy. And a review of Krieger's later book, The Institution of Theory, the reviews from 1996, opined that, quote, one of deconstruction's most startling discoveries is that all texts, fictional, non-fictional, poetic, etc., are dependent on a series of tropes leading back ultimately to the sun. All texts from the Bible to Locke's essay to Stephen King's latest are all finally narratives. They tell a story. How they are judged, i.e. as low or high art, sacred or profane, scientific or science fiction, is beside the point. They all employ rhetorical and tropological figures to make their case, end quote. Now this position corresponds very closely to Malcolm Bull's delineation of the position of the Philistine. This is Bull. The Philistine should argue not that existing objects are of temporary as opposed to durable aesthetic value, or that, although they may once have been or may yet become valuable, all existing objects are valueless, but that all objects are permanently aesthetically valueless. In consequence, any object whose value is derived solely from its classification as an art object is fit only for recycling, end quote. So, seen as Philistinism, deconstruction elides devaluation and recycling in suggesting that all text's fundamental characteristic is merely a recycled ancient heliotropism. The undifferentiated commodification which results from this understanding of texts is homologous with the overproduction which Dummett and others saw as the key Thatcherite impact upon professional academic research. Philistinism then signifies modernity, the decline of authentic philosophy, and having no time for the unquantifiable dimensions of texts. Through the melding together of these three meanings, the same charge of Philistinism was levelled at Derrida and at Thatcher. So concluding then, it's worth comparing Hebblethwaite's and McCann's homologies between Derrida and Thatcherism, because despite reaching the same conclusion and despite both being enlisted as an encouragement to vote non-plaquette, despite this, they diverge crucially. Hebblethwaite bases the homology on a shared Philistinism, whereas McCann actually bases it on a lack of Philistinism. McCann's anecdote about homelessness, where sympathy with the plaquettes overlooks actual suffering in favour of being preoccupied with a rarefied conceptual matter, amounts to actually accusing such sympathy of a certain anti-Philistinism. That isn't just because Philistine was a German term for a townsperson or a non-student, but because more generally it's a term by which a perceived lack of education is made into a point of a kind of qualitative distinction. And this is the gesture which McCann makes, despite his avowed sympathy with the two teenage boys who are now living in the street outside my faculty. So for McCann, deconstruction corroborates conservatism in its anti-Philistine priorities. So the heterology between these homologies of Derrida and Thatcher is significant because it offers a focused instance of something I argue throughout the book, which is that the critique of Derrida founders precisely where it seeks to demarcate what ought to be proper to philosophy. For McCann, what most urgently need to be thought are materially disadvantageous circumstances which deconstruction and conservatism neglect in favour of the more abstracted concerns of the academy. For Hebblethwaite, deconstruction and conservatism's shared neglect is instead a lack of respect for the rarefied atmosphere of the university. But where these homologies are homologous is in their presupposition of an ideal interiority which undergirds this thinking. For McCann, universities should be places where social justice can be strategized. For Hebblethwaite, they should be places for work which is guaranteed autonomy from government intervention. In both cases, deconstruction is said to threaten this interiority. For McCann, deconstruction's greater concern with ideas than with people severs the relation to the outside by which the inside is constituted. The university ought to be where one thinks about the people who exist outside of it, is basically his position. Whereas for Hebblethwaite, deconstruction legitimizes a plebeian compromise of the ineffable dimensions of university work. So the ambivalent relation between these homologies derives ironically from their attempts to preserve the university from the ambivalence of deconstruction and conservatism through an appeal to the interiority proper to the university. The form of this argument contains an element that is hostile to it, which is manifest through the attempt to immunize the university from what is hostile to it. So just briefly returning to the title of this paper, A Virtuous Middle Ground. Middle ground, the phrase middle ground, before it became a metaphor connoting a position of moderation, was actually a naval term for a shallow area serving as an obstacle to confident navigation. Thanks.
Thank you, Niall. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, we'll move across to Benoit. Benoit, over to you.
Thanks a lot, John, and thanks a lot, Niall. In your precise and remarkable book, you gave to the Cambridge affair all its dimensions, academic, philosophical, but also historical and political meaning. And as a biographer of Derrida, I will just try to situate some element of the affair in the life and career of Derrida. As he explained in 1995, so a few years later, when he received another honorary degree at Queen's University in Canada, he said, "The last time I had the honor of being conferred such an honorary degree in an English-speaking university, but on another continent, in Cambridge, England, it was at the end of a war both serious and comical, a ferocious war that was waged between them, only between them, our English colleagues. In academia and in the media, especially in the newspapers, some professors then made it known in an unprecedented tone that they found the award of such a doctorate provocative and intolerable. Such an event made me more aware of the fact that sometimes honorary degrees are not purely conventional rituals." And those lines, I think, are very important in Derrida's conception. We have to remember and to insist on the fact that conflict has always been at the heart of Derrida's work, career, and thoughts. Conflict is not just an accident, it's part of his philosophy. It happened in France, in Germany, and even in the United States, where he was so famous for many years, but it happened especially in the UK. The third journey of Derrida to London and Oxford happened in 1968. in Oxford, at that time, he had a strong confrontation with Alfred Jules Eyre. He never forgot this difficult moment. This was something really violent, and he had the impression that his thought, his philosophy, was totally rejected. But we have to remember that Derrida himself did not fear controversy and often considered philosophy as a sort of fight, as people say in German, a Kampfplatz. Philosophy is not the quiet search for truth with people collaborating together, but ideas are fighting. And of course, when Derrida is reading Kant, Kant doesn't protest, but when he is reading Foucault or Lévi-Strauss, they have protested a lot, and the fight was, as we know, very important. So he had also this very violent controversy with John Searle and the books that was published later as Limited Ink, which is very, very difficult conflict, and certainly a lot of people in Cambridge and during the Cambridge affair knew this violent aspect of Derrida's philosophy. There were also in 1987, so 5 years before the affair, two major conflicts which left important traces. There was the world famous Heidegger affair, with the biography published by Victor Farias insisting on his Nazi past. But this conflict was directly related to deconstruction and Derrida, because as we all know, there are so many connections between Heidegger and Derrida, and there were the ideas that Derrida didn't criticize enough Heidegger. But there was exactly at the same moment, and more in the United States where it was so famous, the Paul Deman affair. Shortly after the death of Paul Deman, who was an important figure in Yale University and a colleague and a friend of Derrida, some news articles published in Le Soir during World War II were revealed. Some of the texts were clearly anti-Semitic. And Derrida, even if he was a Jew and he was a victim of anti-Semitic laws as a kid during World War II, he defended his friend in the book Memoir for Paul Deman, and maybe a little too much. And so at that time, Derrida was attacked politically, not only philosophically, but politically. He was suspected of being an enemy of enlightenment and reason, especially in Germany, by Jürgen Habermas. And his career in Germany became very, very difficult from the beginning of the 90s. At that time, he was already attacked very often from the right, but it was the first moment that he was also attacked from the left. And we see some elements of this, with this very strange association in the Cambridge affair between Thatcher and Derrida. Of course, in France and for many readers of Derrida, he was considered as an enemy of Thatcher and Thatcher's idea of university. But the Cambridge affair is, for him, also related to other academic difficulties. And we have to remember this because he reacted in a very sensitive way, emotional way. In France, too, Derrida was often rejected by the institution and the university. Even if he was very famous and popular, had a lot of readers outside of the academic circle. Also, he was famous internationally. He was refused the succession of Paul Ricoeur at the University of Nanterre. And this was a shock for him, because it was not such a high degree to succeed to Paul Ricoeur, and both were specialists of Husserl. Later, he couldn't even apply for the Collège de France, a very famous institution. Bourdieu tried to have two philosophers entering in the Collège de France. One was Jacques Bouvresse, specialist of Wittgenstein, and the other one was Derrida. And Bouvresse was immediately accepted, and Derrida was automatically refused, rejected. Even in the United States, where he was so famous, Derrida's success was ambiguous. For it is outside the departments of philosophy that deconstruction was so successful. To follow Derrida's teaching implied to live philosophy for students, and to go to literature department or arts, law studies, or even theology or political studies. But inside the philosophical departments, it was impossible to work with Derrida. And many people, conservative people, criticized him because he was related, in their mind, and maybe in reality, to the transformation of university departments and the creation of new departments as cultural studies, gender studies, queer studies, post-colonial studies. And so for some people at that time, this was the destruction of the old basis of the university. Behind the Cambridge affair, there is, of course, a major conflict between two conceptions of philosophy. It's obvious, but we have to remember it. There is a conflict between analytic philosophy and what is called continental philosophy. In France, we never speak about continental philosophy. We just speak about philosophy. But in the Anglo-Saxon world, when we speak about philosophy, we speak directly about the analytic philosophy. And we could say that there is a conflict, a silent conflict, an implicit conflict between a philosophy of the answer linked to logic and to search for truth, as in science, as in mathematics, and a philosophy of the question, which is linked to worry, unrest, anxiety in a way, and which doesn't want to produce a truth, a final truth. When asked someday if there was a philosophy of Derrida, he answered no. But this doesn't mean that he was not a philosopher, and probably Socrates would have also answered no. Is there a philosophy of Socrates? No. Derrida thinks that his philosophy, a large part of his first philosophy, is to reread the history of philosophy, focusing on its margins, on the forgotten elements of the tradition. And this is a primary meaning of the word deconstruction. Deconstruction is a sort of rereading. There are still a lot of misinterpretations of the idea of deconstruction. Many people, even amongst the philosophers, believed that deconstruction was a sort of destruction, of nihilism. At the time of the Cambridge affair, some of the enemies in non-Placket, accused Derrida's philosophy to be a poison, a virus, a danger for the students, a danger for the institution, a danger for philosophy itself. And some people said to give an honorary degree to Derrida is a sort of suicide for university. So we see how serious is the debate. There is also a major, and I will finish on this point, a major conflict between letters and philosophy. We remember that it was the department of, and you remind it in your book, it was the department of letters which offered to Derrida the honorary degree, and the department of philosophy, which was going to be outraged by this idea because Derrida was part and wasn't part of philosophy, but letters were not able to decide if he was a good candidate. So there are a lot of paradox there. He is a literary person, but he's connected to philosophy, so you cannot decide without us. But this ambiguity is not just an accident. It cannot be separated from the work of Derrida. As a young man, I show it in my biography, he wanted to become a sort of writer, maybe more writer than a philosopher, with the examples of Camus and Sartre, which were so influential in his youth. And they were both novelists, writing theater dramas and philosophy and critical work. And his dream remained, and this dream remained until the end. Just a few days before his death, when he was very ill, he was considered for the Nobel Prize of Literature. And probably if he hadn't died a few days later, he would have received it, which would have been very important. And for him, this was maybe more important than the idea to be a great philosopher. So the choice by the letters department was not absurd. And there is another paradox. One of the most translated thinkers in the world is also one of the most attached to his own language, the French language. And he is one of the most difficult philosophers to translate, because the ambiguity of words is always there. And there is no idea of direct communication, of transparency of philosophy. There is the idea that thought is closely connected to the language and to a specific language. He always wanted to read carefully philosophical work as text, not only as ideas. This is the basic idea of close reading. He had the obsession to write philosophy as a text, as a real text. We can see it in books like La or The Postcard. His thought is linked to words, to their ambiguities. If we remember the title of one of his books about Blanchot, demeure. Demeure is a French word which has double or triple meanings, and it's almost impossible to translate it properly. But this book was translated with a lot of footnotes and explanations of the translator. He plays constantly, as the readers know, on words, with words. And this was probably considered as totally non-serious and non-acceptable on the non-plaquette side. A philosophy so connected to language and to literature cannot be a real philosophy. But I believe that this close connection between language and thought is a very important heritage of Derrida's thought. Thank you.
Thank you, Benoit. Niall, do you want to respond to the response?
Yeah, I mean, that was wonderful, amazingly rich response, Benoit. Thank you very much. I mean, I'll just start with your final point about the textuality of philosophy and Derrida's consistent emphasis on it. This is absolutely the thing that it seems as though during the Cambridge affair, many people from certain philosophical traditions just can't get their heads around. You know, they really struggle with the idea. They think that it represents such a compromise or such a concession. It's a very strange. It is kind of a middle ground in the way I was using it in my paper. It's a point of an obstacle to a dialogue. I think the way you frame analytic philosophy as the philosophy of the answer and continental philosophy as a philosophy of the question, I think that's a really illuminating and workable kind of way of putting it. And it also speaks to the fact that, you know, Derrida, there are very few occasions where you can take propositions out of Derrida's work and say, finally, this is what he thought about X, this is what he thought, because everything's taking place in a kind of immanent critique of the text he's reading at the time. His ideas emerge through the reading, emerge through the engagement. And again, this was seen at the time as being somehow to do with evasiveness or slipperiness or refusing to take a position. Very strange misapprehension, I think. And I mean, John could certainly say more about the confrontation between Derrida and A.J. Ayer in Oxford, because I know you talk about that in your book, in Someone Called Derrida. So, and also finally, I would say that I think it's really important what you said about what Derrida said when he was receiving his honorary at Queen's in Canada, where he said that he kind of talked about the unprecedented tone by which he was attacked at the time, and certainly had a certain negative recollection of it. But at the same time, he said that it reminded him that honorary doctorates can be more than simply conventional things. And it's that sort of double way of looking at it that Derrida had about the Cambridge affair throughout, that he was quite shocked, I think, by a lot of what was said about him and his work, but at the same time he retained an appreciation for the importance that the importance of the honorary degree that was kind of implicit in the fact that there had been such a debate. So it's quite an interesting double movement he had there, and he gave an interview that a long interview with Stephen Collini, Christopher Johnson, and Marion Hobson, where he refers to it in those terms as well. So yeah, they were just three of some, three of the many points you made that I responded to. But yeah, that was a wonderful response, and thank you very much for doing it.
Just one word, one short word. There was probably some afterthought in Derrida's reaction, and we can see that in the last 10 years of his life, let's say just after the Cambridge affair, he was in a way more and more ethical and more political. There was probably the trauma of the double affair of Heidegger and Paul Deman, but there was also a real evolution. The first part of his career is a little more, let's say, connected to rereading the tradition of philosophy. But in the last years and in his seminars that are now published, we see that the question of taking seriously ethical and political questions developed more and more in his work. And maybe this is a strange consequence of the Cambridge affair and the idea that he was not connected to people. He was only connected to words. And when we see the themes about forgiveness, about death penalty, and many others in the last years, we see maybe he tried in a way to answer very precisely to some of his critics. He said, and also the question of the animal, he said that his philosophy was always a political and ethical and religious interrogation, but we see it much more in the last 10 or 12 years of his life.
Yeah, it's fascinating to think that the Cambridge affair may have played a part in that intensification of focus on those issues. Yeah, that's a fascinating point. Yeah.
Okay, I'll just ask the very sort of general question, really, I suppose, which is that if you like, some nerve is being touched, as it were, when Derrida, as it were, lands in Cambridge. Some nerve is touched. We might say, do you want to, either of you want to push further at what that nerve might be, if you like? What war is it, Benoit, if you like? Is it Cambridge, as it were, versus Derrida as Algerian, French, Jewish, American, anarchist, secular, Cambridge being ancient theological institution in origin, or even orality versus writing. Going back to one of the big emphases from Niall's paper. So I've thrown a lot of suggestions at you, but I'm just wondering if either of you want to push any more on what war it might have been opening the door to all sorts of possibilities.
All the themes that you are evoking are really important and part of the thing. There is a strange aspect in Derrida's mind and type of reaction. He always felt that he was rejected from his childhood. When he was 12, he was rejected from school as a Jewish boy. When he was a student in Paris, the exams at Normal Sup or Agrégation were very difficult in the institution in France and even in the United States. He had the impression to be rejected. And this was his personal representation. So Cambridge is once again, they don't want me. And this is very strange for us, because when we analyze the career of Derrida, we have the impression that he was a dominant figure, that he was a master, he was famous, he was à la mode. But inside, he always felt as the poor Algerian Jewish boy rejected by everybody, and they don't want me, and then they don't like me, or even they hate me. And they don't understand what I'm saying. They think that it's not serious, but those questions, even the personal questions, were so serious for him. And he was certainly not just a player. He wanted to build something and to speak about the world and the ethics, and he felt rejected because people didn't want to understand it. But in fact, we have also to insist on the fact that Derrida's philosophy is difficult. Some books are very difficult to read, and some people were working with a sort of good faith. They didn't reject him only because they hated him, but because sincerely it was difficult for them to enter in the text, especially in the translated texts. And his close connection to French language made things more difficult, because the first translations sometimes were not very precise. And maybe a very precise translation is an utopia also for Derrida's work.
Thank you. Niall, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, so I'll maybe speak. Benoit has spoken about the nerve of the nerve that was touched in Derrida himself. I'd maybe talk about the nerve that Derrida was touching. I would say, first of all, that what's quite interesting, just thinking about it, is that it's not long after this debate, the Cambridge affair, that around about 1995, which saw the formation of the Cybernetic Culture Research Unit at Warwick University. So that's Nick Land, Mark Fisher, and Sadie Plant, among others. But that sets off a trajectory of accelerationist philosophy, which saw Derrida as, ironically enough, not being this great threat to philosophy, but as actually being the last gasp of the old guard of philosophy. And so nowadays that's quite a famous part of Quentin Meillassoux philosophy, and his followers like Graham Harman see Derrida in those terms as the kind of final Kantian philosopher, if you like. So it's quite interesting how quickly things sort of change, how Derrida sort of went quite quickly. That's quite a different, an interesting change. But as for the nerve that Derrida was touching, it's a very difficult question. And again, John, I know that in someone called Derrida, you have a lot of ideas about that kind of thing. But I suppose I would maybe focus on how the late collection by Immanuel Kant, The Conflict of the Faculties, which isn't all that widely read as a book, and in fact Derrida spent more time on it than most as a text. There is a kind of received idea in Kant studies that after a certain point his work becomes sort of inferior because of his mental illness and things. But In that text, Kant very influentially proposes that the philosophy faculty is kind of subtends the faculties of theology, medicine, and law. That it ought to possess no executive or actual power of its own, but ought to have a kind of autonomy, which is sort of different to those faculties which are all about sending people into the world to do things, whereas the philosophy faculties is different from those. And what interests me about that text is that, as Derrida points out in his reading of The Conflict of the Faculties, there is a central tension in what Kant is saying in that text, because he's insisting on the unconditional autonomy of the philosophy faculty, but he's also insisting that the state grants the philosophy faculty that unconditional autonomy. So there is this tension in the text between the will to autonomy, but also the recognition that this autonomy needs to be kind of granted or gifted from precisely that against which one wants to see oneself as autonomous, if you like. And in a sense, that text of Kant's is a big part of my book, and it returns in very interesting ways in these appeals to philosophy as somehow a qualitatively distinct type of study from all else. Appeals which are never really backed up with argument, but are kind of taken as read. But then there is also this frustration that, as I sort of tried to show in my paper, that seems to have something to do with the fact that this autonomy isn't real autonomy, and this interiority of philosophy isn't real interiority. It's a kind of make-believe. And I suppose that maybe the nerve Derrida was touching is that he nags at that question throughout, and even in his, the 10 years before the Cambridge affair, he co-founded the Collège International de Philosophie, and he was involved in the research group for philosophical education. And he was at once insisting that philosophy wasn't studied enough, wasn't studied early enough by children, wasn't studied properly enough. But at the same time, he was insisting that it ought to be seen as imbricated with other disciplines, that all disciplines have philosophy as part of them, and that there is this kind of porous boundary between philosophy and other disciplines. And so I think Derrida was kind of producing the nerve Derrida was touching. If I would come down on just one, I mean, John, you proposed a lot of possible avenues, but I would say it has something to do with that, something to do with a make-believe autonomy of philosophy, which they kind of knew wasn't really there, if you like.
Benoit, do you want to come back at all, or? Oh, sorry.
No, say thank you.
Okay. I'll ask you one last question, if I may, and then we will finish. So we've probably got about 5-6 minutes. Derrida famously writes, talks of his misadventures at Oxford and Cambridge. I think it's the late 90s. My misadventures at Oxford and Cambridge, drawing very obviously on the Alice narrative, obviously an Oxonian narrative in origin, presenting himself as a literary figure, and picking up on your middle groundness, Niall, and the textual literariness of Derrida that you're talking about, Benoit. Is there any sense, do you think, that as Derrida encounters these institutions, he is always already a literary figure? He is always already enacting in his head and in his perception, in his perception as a literary figure, that he is always already a kind of narrative, both in his own head, as it were, and in his reception. Final thought, if either of you want to pick up on anything there.
What is certain is that Derrida never wanted to choose, to make a clear choice between literature and philosophy. He wanted both. And he wanted also the idea of a sort of general philosophy, but also a very personal and autobiographical philosophy. And so he's in the tradition of Saint Augustine, Rousseau, Nietzsche, and Kierkegaard. Those are major philosophers, and also in a more minor way, Camus and Sartre, as I told. But I think Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, Rousseau, they are really important in that way. When you read a book as Ecce Homo, you cannot say, is this philosophy, is this literature, is this poetry, is this autobiography, of course, with Zarathustra, we have the same questions. Some of the books of Kierkegaard suggest exactly the same thing. And he wanted both because, of course, there were a lot of ideas in a book like, and you know it well, the postcard, for example, but it can also be read, the first part of the postcard, En Voix, has a continuity of love letters. And this mixture between very personal elements and very serious elements were perceived by a lot of people, and especially probably in the UK, more than in the United States, as an impossible mixture. And then I think that we should see carefully what happens between Derrida and the UK after the Cambridge affair. But I think that he didn't want to come very often. There was an important trace. It was, in a way, not a final chapter because he had a lot of friends in Great Britain. Certainly, he had some friends, but for the institution, I think he was afraid to a new misadventure. And probably he got a little bored with this repeated conflicts.
Niall, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I'd just very briefly say that I think, one of Derrida's points, which is quite often misinterpreted, is that what is often seen as him undermining the text he's reading is actually really it's more accurate to say that he is showing the ways in which philosophical texts are creative in ways that perhaps their authors didn't realize themselves, maybe, or perhaps had repressed in certain ways. And so what is often mistaken in the Cambridge affair and elsewhere as being an attempt to undermine the singularity of the philosophical text is actually an attempt to kind of increase its significance, increase the way it signifies, and the creative register, the philosophy is creative despite itself, is a big part of that. And I think, yeah, that's definitely something that Derrida was keen to stress.
Okay, thank you, Niall. Thank you, Benoit. Thank you, friends, colleagues, students, for joining us. And I will switch off in 1 second. But yeah, thank you very much, everybody. And we will send out the recording and on to everybody that emailed. So thank you very much, Benoit. Thank you very much, Niall. Bye-bye.
Thank you for organising this, John, as well.
My pleasure.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye. Shalom. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Take care.